Hi, everyone. We are on our third and last week devoted to Steven Shapin's The Scientific Revolution. And in the last chapter or part, he really amps up the discussion of the social and the political dimensions of science. And he does that by moving from the first and second questions in parts one and two, which were what was known, how was it known, to the third one, which is why it was known. In other words, why are people doing science in the first place? And why at this particular moment in history? And this is where he's really going to foreground the role that extra scientific forces have in the creation of science. So, all those pressures that really led to the emergence of science in the 17th century. And he gives two examples. He gives other ones, but I here only want to highlight two examples to give you a sense of the kind of work that he's trying to do. The first one has to do with economics. And he says you cannot think about the emergence of science without asking the very basic question of money. Who is paying for it? Who is bankrolling the labor of the scientists? And more importantly, you cannot separate that from the additional question of what are the interests of the people who are financing scientific work, or not necessarily the people, but maybe the institutions that are financing this kind of work. And of course, in the 17th century, there really are only two sources for revenue for somebody who wants to do science. So if I am in the 17th century and I want to be a scientist, obviously I need time to do science, which means that I can't have a job, let's say in the fields or in a home or whatever. I need time, and that means that I need somebody to pay me to do that kind of work, or to at least finance my studies. And at the time, I really only have two choices if I'm in this situation. One of them is to go directly to the church and to get funding from the church. And the church did finance a good number of intellectual pursuits. The problem, of course, is that if you go to the science, then you're answerable. I'm sorry, if you go to the church, then you are answerable to the church. And so there are some conditions that the church is going to place on you if they're going to be paying for your work. There are certain things that you cannot say. There are certain theories that you cannot defend. There are certain theories that you cannot attack. And so you effectively become, as a scientist, an extension of the church. You become kind of like this scientific tentacle coming out of the body of the church that is in many ways, subdued by the church, or at least subjected to its will. Now, if you don't want to go to the church, where do you go? Well, most people would go to something like a prince, or a king, or to some head of state that has a lot of resources at their disposal to affect to be a patron. And so they sought the patronage of these political figures. But once again, there are some conditions that come with that kind of patronage. And according to Steven Shapin, you could argue that none of this matters, that where the money's coming from, why the money is given in the first place, that none of that changes anything, because it's just an external ornamental element that doesn't have anything to do with the science. But maybe it does. Maybe it shifts. It determines what gets studied and what doesn't, and how it gets talked about and how it doesn't. Now, a little bit down the road, after the 17th century, so by the time you get to like the 18th century, you have the birth of a third source of revenue, which are scientific societies. And I talked about the Royal Society of London in in connection to part two. Um, but he talks about it again in part three. And he says, when all these scientific societies, and by the way, scientific societies were just groups of like gentlemen, and typically they were just men, from the upper class, from the upper middle class, who would get together and they would do science, and they would have some money that they would have at their disposal for conducting experiments, and then they would publish their findings. So they were these like science clubs, if you want to think about it that way. And so this becomes a preferred source of funding for a lot of scientists because it seems like there are less strings attached. Like you don't have the church like murmuring in your ear, like don't say this, don't say that. You also don't have to worry that if you offend the king or the prince that your head is going to roll. It just seems all around like a better way to go if you want to be a scientist. But Steven Shapin says, well, if you look at the research that's actually being done in these societies, if you look on the ground at what they're doing, isn't it bizarre that the majority of the things that they're doing are things with a clear commercial application? So technologies that, are connected to economics and that might have this benefit, or two, things that have a very clear militaristic use. That's what's being done in these societies. And so it's not as if this scientific labor is wholly detached from worldly interests. In fact, quite the opposite. It's fully imbricated in these interests. And so this is all like one example that he gives about why we need to look outside of science to understand science, in this case, economics. But then he gives a whole other example, which has to do with religion. So no longer with economics. And he says there's a way in which we've been conditioned to think that science and religion are arch nemesis, right? Like there is nothing less religious than science, and there is nothing less scientific than religion. But if you look one, and this is the move that he always makes, if you look at what scientists are actually doing, what they're actually writing, what they're putting on paper, there's a lot more crossover between religion and science than we tend to realize. So some scientists were themselves fully, like they were almost theologians on their own, and they wrote about scripture, and sometimes they even invoked religious ideas in order to make their scientific theories hold in place. So, for example, Isaac Newton will make the argument that there is a clear connection between his physics, like the three laws of motion, and Christianity, because they both prove the unity of nature. So science and religion for him are not opposite; they actually complement one another really, really well. Now, this is not to say that there aren't very real tensions between science and religion. We know that a lot of scientists were attacked for their beliefs by the church. Very famously, Giordano Bruno, who said that the universe was infinite, was burned at the stake. That's a pretty high price to pay for defending the infinity thesis. But even Galileo, we know that he was condemned by the church, and even though he was not burned at the stake, he was, put in house arrest. And so there were real tensions. It's not to say that they're the same, but they're not as different as we've been led to believe. And one of the more interesting expressions of this unity or this friendship between science and religion is that at some point in the 17th and early 18th centuries, scientists start defending what they do on religious grounds. So sometimes they would look at priests or at the church and say, look, your job as the church is to read the book of scripture, the revealed truth that God gave us in the form of this written book, the Bible, and you interpret that. That's your job. You're the priest, you're the pope, you do your thing. But remember that in the Bible, there are two books that God created. There is the book, there is the Bible, but then there is the book of nature, in which God basically put his intentions. And so, according to the Bible, nature itself is infused with God's spirit. And you can read the mind of God by reading the book of nature in the same way that you can read the mind of God by reading the book of scripture. And so a number of scientists, and Newton was one of them, start making this argument that's kind of bizarre, but also really interesting and clever, where they say, we're kind of priests ourselves. It's just that we're reading a different book. We're not reading the book, we're reading the book of nature. And your book is not more important or more fundamental than ours. Both of them give us equal access to the will of God. And so there's a way in which the scientists almost start taking the form of priests on their own, and science becomes a branch of theology. Again, this is only one argument that some scientists started to make as a way of defending themselves from the church. But the point being that they could make this argument, and that therefore there was this interplay between science and religion that, of course, has been lost in the present moment. I don't know of a lot of scientists that would describe themselves as theologians, although there are some, especially people who work in astronomy, who will say things like, when you look at the universe, I see order in the universe. And so I come to see God through the order that I discover as a scientist. Not many, but they do exist. And this was a common move in the 17th century. So I'll stop there, only as a way of pointing to two examples of the ways in which Steven Shapin takes science and draws out the non-scientific, political, religious dimensions. Again, as a way of saying that the scientific revolution was not just scientific. It was, in fact, a cultural, religious, political, economic revolution. And it's only later that we look back at it and separate all the factors and then come up with this pristine object that we call science, and then project a number of qualities onto it that it didn't really have in actuality. Okay, so I hope you have enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and that by the end of it, you will have enjoyed this book, since this will bring to a conclusion our discussion of this externalist approach to the history of science. Okay, bye bye.